Hello everyone, this is Dr. Frank King here with a video to help you understand the issues of systemic oppression. This is the second video of a series to answer questions from people who are curious about the murder of George Floyd at the hands of the Minneapolis police and the ensuing nationwide rebellions that took place. Today I want to talk about police accountability. We will see that police seldom go to jail or even lose their jobs as a result of police brutality or killings. I use a lot of sources, but some of the major sources that I recommend are the following. With Liberty for Some, 500 Years of Imprisonment in America by Scott Christensen. Capital and Convict, Race, Region, and Punishment in the Post-Civil War America by Henry Kamerling. Slave Patrols, Law and Violence in Virginia and in the Carolinas by Sally Hayden. Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis. These works provide a historical narrative of how policing and race have been connected since the inception of our modern policing. I am also relying on the work by Philip Stinson, a criminal justice professor at Bowling Green University, who specializes on police accountability. When I was in grad school, my understanding that policing and racism were intertwined was helped when I took classes that used the work of French philosopher Louis Althusser. His theory of the ISA, or ideological state apparatus, and the RSA, or repressive state apparatus, helped me understand that when there are instances of violence perpetrated by the police, it was the police doing the will of the state, and that is exactly what the police are supposed to do. Now, I have a disclaimer. I live in Platteville, Wisconsin, and I am on the Platteville Police and Fire Commission. Our primary job is to recommend hiring and firing and other disciplinary actions to the chief of police. I've worked with the chief, and we have had multiple conversations on policing and systemic racism. I teach criminal justice majors in my courses, and they will be future police. This particular discussion is about addressing systemic racism and how the police and criminal justice system have been historically used as the primary tools to oppress Black and brown bodies. There are multiple ways to use the ISA-RSA theory in analyzing oppression, but I'm going to use it to discuss race and crime, particularly the police. Althusser talks about the ways in which the state or government exercises power. The ISA are institutions like religion, education, politics, communication, culture. When it comes to racism in the United States, it was ingrained in components of every ISA. Religion, primarily Christianity in the US, was used to rationalize slavery and Black inferiority, from the image of Jesus being white to Bible verses. You think about education and the lack of racial representation, not just K-12, but how the media and politicians use narratives to depict people of color as criminal. This is something that has been happening for centuries, to the point that it's now in our collective psyche. In the late 1600s, statutes known as slave codes were created to ensure African slaves and European indentured servants would not unify. This was a huge fear by the upper elite, and I'll make another video on the tactics to keep Blacks and whites from unifying in the near future. Slave codes forbade interracial relationships, slaves from reading, slaves from owning guns or property, and other laws to ensure Blacks stayed at the bottom of the racial hierarchy. In the 18th and 19th centuries, religious leaders had sermons talking about white folks being God's chosen, and slavery was a positive due to Black inferiority. Thomas Jefferson said that Blacks were inferior in his notes on the state of Virginia. He also told scientists to prove this, and they tried. Scientists tried to show in every way, falsifying and simply making up information to somehow show that whites were superior. And journals upon journals were used to show this. The ISA's components of science, religion, education, and communication all merged to show Blacks were inferior and therefore justified their subjugation. This is where the RSA, or repressive state apparatus, comes into play. Police first started in the United States as night watches to protect villagers from indigenous Americans in the 17th and 18th centuries. The National Constable Association's encyclopedia states that police in St. Louis were formed to protect the city from Native Americans. The ISA creates the narrative of the savage marauder trying to kill the good white citizenry. For slaves, plantation patrols were created to enforce the slave codes and capture runaway slaves. They did so with violence, as blacks were not seen as humans and could be punished with impunity. The European model of policing was not primarily to maintain law and order, to serve and protect, but it was to ensure the separation between the haves and the have-nots. Slaves were property, and the police ensured securing property rights for the elites. Here is an image I found on the Twitter feed of historian Lou Moore, professor at Grand Valley State University. It is a newspaper ad by future president immortalized on the $20 bill, Andrew Jackson, asking for the return of his slave. He describes the slave in detail and encourages whoever brings the slave back to him to brutalize to the point of near death by offering, quote, $10 extra for every 100 extra lashes, up to 300. There were two narratives taking place about slaves. The first was the happy-go-lucky slave who were docile and happy. Like cattle, they were easy to control, but had to be controlled nevertheless. Therefore, it was the notion that slavery was necessary because blacks were animals without purpose. Bondage gave them that purpose. The other narrative was that slaves were always scheming, could not be trusted, potentially plotting to kill whites. I cannot emphasize this enough. Whites were in constant fear of slave revolts, to the point that some slave codes forbade slaves from gathering in groups larger than 4. It was a constant fear. There was the belief of an uncontrollable, animalistic, violent behavior inherent in blacks, and slavery was the only means of control. The plantation police and slave patrols were deputized by the state to enforce the racial hierarchy. The Citadel, the military university in South Carolina, was created as a military outpost and armory as a reaction to the attempted slave revolt led by Denmark Vesey in 1822. Outposts and laws were made to control slaves and enforce brutal punishments due to white fear of insurrections. The police, military, state, and federal governments all worked to suppress black existence with the utmost violence. After the Civil War, the narrative of the happy, docile slave became part of the mythology of slavery. But blacks as uncontrollable, animalistic, violent criminal became the common narrative. And as slavery declines and eventually disappears, the prison population and policing boom across the South. Now, there were two different ways the ISA supported the RSA in controlling black bodies after slavery. One was by creating black codes, outlawing blacks any rights and building upon slave codes. Interracial relationships were outlawed. Loitering laws were created to arrest blacks for just hanging out. Being black and unemployed was against the law. Blacks looking a white person in the eye or not moving to the other side of the street if a white person was walking. Blacks were only allowed certain types of jobs and could not compete with a white business. This created a boom of exploiting black bodies in the form of convict leasing, and I will create a video about that later on. Jim Crow laws were also enacted to keep blacks at the bottom of the white supremacist structure. These written and unwritten rules could lead to violence if they didn't comply to the social contract. The police were there to enforce these laws and were given permission to use absolute brutality without question. The ISA was to maintain a racial hierarchy that denied blacks any rights, and the slightest accusation of breaking the law could be a death sentence. The second way the ISA supported the RSA's violence was the vigilante mobs that were common in the United States. Often, if law enforcement did not do the job of imposing violence, the citizens of the community would make sure they applied brutality, often with police approval or non-intervention. A report from the Equality Justice Initiative shows that there were over 4,400 lynchings between the late 1800s and the 1940s. One book, Without Sanctuary, gives a visual presentation of how these lynchings were photographed and celebrated, so much that many were made into postcards to be mailed to friends and family. They became family and community gatherings where people brought food. Now, when we talk about the word picnic, there's an urban myth that the word derives from picking a black person to kill. That's not true. It's a French term for eating and drinking outside. But we cannot deny that lynchings were activities that reflected parties and communal gatherings. And while the vast majority of the victims were black, we can see there were Asians, Jews, and European immigrants that were killed as well, because they too were seen as a threat to the white supremacist structure. What did the police do during this time? They supported it, or allowed it to happen. The police maintained the social order of white supremacy because they were, in fact, white supremacists themselves. I wanted to give you a brief history of policing, primarily in the South prior to World War II, so you can see how ingrained policing of black and brown bodies is with violence. In the next episode, we will talk about how the criminal justice systems continues to view black and brown folks as enemies of the state, as well as how policing took place in the North. I am Dr. Frank King, and I ask that you like, subscribe, and share with friends and family. Peace and take care.